Hello, everyone. This is Gabrielle Hurd with the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program in the National Park Service. And it is September 9th, 2022. And I am here with
Mosunmola Ogunmolaji.
Anna Hamilton.
And we are interviewing Stephanie Gilbert. Would you mind spelling your name for the record?
Sure. STEPHANIE GILBERT.
Excellent. And would you mind telling me about when and where you were born?
I was born in Jacksonville, Florida in April of 1968.
So you're a Floridian as well.
Not really. I was only born there, and then I left pretty quickly as an infant.
Well, you're still a Floridian in our books. But
okay, yeah. I'll own that. I'll own that.
Can you tell us about your parents, grandparents, and where you grew up?
Sure. So I grew up in the city of Philadelphia for the most part. My parents are Frank and Diane Gilbert. They are also Philadelphians, and my dad was an attorney. He passed away in 2020, but he had been an attorney. And the reason that I say we lived in Philadelphia most of my childhood years was because my parents loved the beach and the Caribbean, and they moved to the Virgin Islands twice. They moved there right after they were married, and then they came back, and then they actually adopted me. I was adopted. So I was adopted from Jacksonville, Florida, and I was flown by a social worker to the Virgin Islands, and they adopted me when I was 5 months old, and so I spent my baby months until I was about 1 in the Virgin Islands, and then they moved back to Philadelphia, and then we went back to the Virgin Islands again when I was about 7 years old, and stayed for a few years.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
That's amazing. You said, I've read your website quite a bit. I really love your writing, I think.
Thank you.
It's so witty and fun to read. And you said your dad was the family historian. Would you mind talking about like the impact that had on you growing up?
Yeah, so Dad was definitely the family historian, and he had a great memory. So he had committed a lot of the family facts to history. He was also the collector of all things. Now, the good thing about the Gilberts is they all seem to be collectors of all things. So there was a lot of stuff. And Dad had boxes of material that he'd collected through his archival of family history. But the one thing about our family is we knew what was passed down through oral history. It was a lot of sensationalism. It was true, it was factual, but they were particular about what they shared and what got passed down. So, the stories were Amelia Earhart is our cousin. Well, that's pretty exciting to know that Amelia Earhart is our cousin, but I was actually more excited when I learned about Oliver's story, and that hadn't been shared. What we knew specifically was that we had someone in our family who had been enslaved, and he had escaped, and he was somehow connected to this the Warfield family, and he had been given as a wedding gift. That was what was passed down.
Oh, so you heard about that before you found the records and stuff of his life?
Yeah, just sort of tangentially, just in passing. It wasn't a big deal. No one, because no one really knew the story. They just knew that there was this history, this thing that existed, but they really wanted to talk more about Amelia Earhart.
Well, that's a great transition. What is your connection to the Underground Railroad?
So my connection is, right now, what I know is that Oliver Cromwell Gilbert, who was my second great-grandfather, escaped slavery in 1848 from Maryland. Fortunately for us, he wrote an autobiography of his life, which included his time in slavery, his escape, and then his time in freedom. Now, when I think about, and he documented it as the Underground Railroad. He was specific in that. So gave us a great bit of detail. But what's really interesting about that is when I think about the Underground Railroad, he escaped in 1848. I think people think the Underground Railroad is this thing that gets you from slavery to some point. And after that, you're free, you're good, right? But 1848, he had a long way to go, almost another 20 years until freedom was real. And so he remained in the care and custody, I'll call it, of the Underground Railroad until actual freedom.
Can you describe custody? What do you mean when you say that
So he tells us, by the way, the autobiography was never published. That's a whole nother story. You probably may have read about that on the blog. But he tells us that as he's moving from place to place, when something would happen, for example, when he was in New York and he was working at a hotel, the Earl's Hotel on Park Row. And I found him in the census working there with a number of other African Americans. So I think this Earl's Hotel probably had a connection. Whomever Mr. Earl was, and he was the owner, probably had some connection where he agreed to allow freedom seekers to work there. But Oliver said while he was serving, I think this was the one where he was going up the stairs or going down the stairs with a breakfast tray, and he ran into a family member of his enslaver. That actually happened to him twice while he was seeking freedom. But in the situation of the Earl's Hotel, when it happened, he fled out the back door, shed his waiter's jacket, and gave us a very specific route that he took to the Underground Railroad headquarters, which is the coffee house, which is on, I think it was on Broadway. I'll have to go back and revisit my notes on that. We visited that less than a year ago and actually traced the route because he gave us so much detail on it. And got to the coffee house, and sure enough, there's a plaque on the wall outside that says, this is you know what I'm talking about, right? This is the Underground Railroad headquarters. So
there was a plaque, at the time, what was it? Do you know how they coded it so that it would be safe?
This is when I went to visit it this year. There's a plaque now. I don't think there was a plaque for him. It was the coffee house. I read about it while we were sitting there. We read about it, and it says that this is where Frederick Douglass was married, that he married his wife in that coffee house.
That's so cool.
Yeah.
But I'm interested in, so it was the headquarters of the Underground Railroad?
That's what Oliver called it.
There was an agreed upon, it wasn't...
For New York, I think, right? For Manhattan.
Sometimes when you hear about the Underground Railroad, it sounds like disconnected safe houses that maybe communicated through word of mouth, but there was a headquarters. He called it the headquarters. Yeah. I'm thinking it was perhaps the New York headquarters. I don't know if it was, the recognized national headquarters. The other thing about the Underground, since you asked about, the organization of the Underground Railroad, he talks about being in Boston during the Shadrach Minkins excitement, Fugitive Slave Act, attempt to recapture. And after that episode, he was sent to New Hampshire. And I, through research, found, and the timing lines up, just months after that event, he winds up with Moses Cartland. He's bearing a letter of introduction from William Lloyd Garrison, and he's sent to Moses. And Moses's family has documentation to confirm, yes, Oliver did arrive. He was a freedom seeker. They knew that. And he actually, when I went through the records of the Boston Vigilance Committee, I found at least two entries on Oliver. One seems to be where someone's being paid to care for him. So there's an entry where someone, I forget who, receives money, and it says it's for Oliver Gilbert,
that could have been for transportation because it coincides, again, with this movement from Boston to New Hampshire. And then later, where Oliver returns to Boston, he seemed to like Boston. So after things settled down in New Hampshire, he went back to Boston, and there's an entry where he pays for his sister's liberty. I think it was $30, which is a lot. And he writes about that. He writes about the plan to free Isabella from slavery. She's still in Baltimore. And actually, William Lloyd Garrison also writes about it. In his book of letters, he's got a letter that he sends to attempt to orchestrate Isabella's escape.
That's incredible. Yeah, there's so many parts of that. Do you want to introduce us to Oliver? Like, who is he separate from, well, there's no way to separate it, but.
Sure,
Yeah.
sure. So Oliver, he was born Oliver Cromwell Kelly, which I think is interesting in and of itself, because when I heard that name, I thought, wow, I mean, I've been researching him for 14 years now. So when I started this, I was ignorant on slavery, right? I didn't use the right terminology. I called people slaves. I'm so embarrassed when I go and I research and I stumble upon old posts on Ancestry where I say, I'm looking for a slave. Come on, right? So, but that was what I knew at the time. So, but when I heard his name, I thought, who is enslaved named Oliver Cromwell Kelly, right? You think of slave names as these nicknames or short names, or so he was born in 1832. At least that's what he documents as his birth. His fugitive ad documents him as being a bit older, but I believe him when he says when he was born. He was born to Cynthia Snowden, who was also enslaved, and a free man from Owingsville, Maryland, named Joseph Kelly. And Cynthia and Joseph had, I believe, 7 children. I think she had 10 children altogether. After Joseph Kelly died, she married again and had 3 more children with John Brooks. But Oliver is on the younger end of Cynthia and Joseph Kelly's children. He was the 4th to escape. There is no evidence that there were any attempts to escape that weren't successful. So his sister Sarah was first, and then his brother Remus, and then Reuben, and then Oliver. Cynthia was the cook of the plantation of the home. There were actually 2 plantations that were together side by side. Actually, probably more like 3, but 2 that were owned by the same family. One plantation was called the Quarter Place. It was the farm. And then adjacent to it, the enslaver built a big house on the hill when he returned from the Revolution. He was a Revolutionary War hero. His name was Gasaway Watkins. We have reason to believe that Cynthia is Gasaway's daughter, and Rachel is her mother. Rachel died right there on the plantation. She was struck by lightning while sitting at the chimney corner. She was also a cook, and the enslaver's family, the governor of Maryland, Edwin Warfield, later wrote to Oliver and told him what he knew or could remember after interviewing his old Aunt Caroline, who was 90 years old at the time, or in her 90s. Caroline confirmed Rachel had been killed by being struck by lightning, but also confirmed that Rachel had charge of the plantation. And Rachel's mother was Celia. I don't know if Celia was a cook or what her role was, but she's also documented. So again, Oliver is on the younger end. He served as a waiter in the home. And so why that's significant is because Gasaway Watkins died when Oliver was 8 years old. But he talks about serving Gasaway as his waiter, standing in the dining room and listening to Gasaway tell thrilling tales of the Revolution. So Gasaway comes back from the Revolutionary War. He's now aging. He's hosting dinner parties. Oliver's standing in the corner as his waiter, and he's listening to these thrilling, he calls them thrilling tales of the revolution, where Gasaway talked about freedom and liberty and how incredible that is. And Oliver said, "You think I was too ignorant to understand, but this is what started to stir my longing for freedom."
That's incredible. It's incredible. What do you know about his life in Richland and his life as in relation to his mother and his ancestors? Like, is there any stories of him spending time with them? I know he
did. So he was up at what he calls the big house, which is the newer house on top of the hill that Gasaway built after he came back from the revolution. And so Cynthia, his mother, was also there. We know that she was the cook up there. Rachel was down at the adjacent farm at Richland in charge of the farm and the work at what they called the quarter place. And Oliver does apparently, there's an interesting story that he weaves into his autobiography about the time that the enslavers' children, who were young at the time, probably his contemporaries, because he's also very young, and they want to teach him to read. And so his job as a young boy was to go and get them from school and escort them home. He would carry their books, get them home. I got the sense that they walked. I didn't get the sense that there were horses involved. So maybe school was close by. But he says the first thing they wanted to do when they got home was have some sweet treats. And so they would all go right to the kitchen where his mother would always prepare something sweet. And they'd say, "Marmy, what do you have sweet to eat?" And then they'd sit down with their sweets and they'd say, "We're going to teach Oliver to read." And his mother said, "Do you think he can learn?" And they said, "Of course he can." And they started to teach him his ABCs. Now, he never learned to read in slavery, but he did learn the beginnings of the alphabet.
That's incredible. When you hear about these stories, about these really cool specifics that come from so far back, or it feels like so far back, like when you're doing your research, do you remember where you found things like that in your research?
So that's all in his autobiography. It's all in the one document, right? So what I've done is, the autobiography is such a treasure. Now, the reason the autobiography is so detailed, this is my belief, is because when Oliver escaped, so escaped in 1848 again, by 1854, I find newspaper documentation, articles that he's now lecturing. He's on the lecture circuit. And what's he talking about? His life in slavery. He continued to lecture until the year before he died. So the last newspaper article that I find of him lecturing is in 1911. So think about that, right? If you experience something in childhood and then you go on the lecture circuit and that becomes your career, and you're telling these stories over and over and over again, 40 or 50 years later, they're still going to be very fresh in your head. You didn't forget because you've been telling them and using them as your platform.
That's incredible. Do you know, like, who did he lecture to when he was on the circuit? Do you know what his
Audiences?
audience?
So we find that he would go, and he seemed to be consistent in it was in the Northeast, Vermont, New Hampshire, areas in New York, Pennsylvania. He was here in Lancaster, he lectured. He would advertise, he'd get to a city, and I think he was organizing, right, the announcements that he was coming. And then he would lecture, and then someone would attend the lecture and write about it afterwards. And then what he would do, and this is where the family history part comes in, he would collect testimonials from people who attended his lectures, and then he would put them in a scrapbook. And he would carry the scrapbook from place to place. And if there was a news article about his lecture, he would clip it and he would put that in a scrapbook. That scrapbook survived until 1991. And we know it was around because I have an elderly cousin who says as a young girl, she remembers seeing the scrapbook. There was one family member who was Oliver's granddaughter, who was the custodian of the scrapbook. And she would bring it to my grandfather's house, and they'd all sit around the kitchen table and look at the scrapbook. Now, that scrapbook was in the home of Oliver's grandson when he died. And at that time, our family decided not to go to the home to clean it out. They hired someone to go clean it out. They didn't know that Oliver's collection, including the autobiography, were in the house. So, and my father stipulated this. He said, yeah, we didn't go. We hired a clean out man, don't know what was there. The clean out man, as you know, we're in Philadelphia, it happens all the time, put everything in the trash and lined the trash bags on the street. Well, what happens I don't know if it happens here in Lancaster, but in Philadelphia, if you line a lot of trash bags on the street and it looks like a house has been cleaned out, who shows up next? The picker. So the picker came, went through the trash bags, found one that looked interesting, contained artifacts that looked like Black history, and this picker knew a memorabilia collector who kept a stall at a flea market. And he took the trash bag in full, which included trash, actual trash, to the flea market and gave it to, I don't know if she bought it or he gave it to her, this memorabilia collector who took it home and spread the autobiography out on her bed, reordered the pages, read it, and she fell in love with Mr. Gilbert, she called him. And she and I connected, gosh, that was 1991. She and I connected in 2000, I think it was 2009 or 10.
So she was with Mr. Gilbert for like almost 20 years.
She kept Mr. Gilbert in a Time Life book in her bedroom. I've never seen it, but she said it was she said, have you ever seen these big Time Life books? Because his autobiography is on legal size paper. And she said it's safe there.
I want to get back to that. I have a whole bunch of questions about that, but
okay.
So going back to Oliver, I want to talk about what you know about his motivation to escape Richland, and if you could describe that journey, the beginning of that journey.
Sure. His motivation was, as he tells us, despite the fact that he had witnessed these thrilling tales of the revolution in the dining room, it was 8 years later, after Gasaway Watkins died in 1840, when Oliver was 8. And he was given to Gasaway's daughter, but she had an abundance of enslaved people. She had more than she needed. And so she gave Oliver to her brother, who lived at Richland. So they're at Walnut Grove. He's living at Walnut Grove with Gasaway. And then he was given to Dr. William Washington Watkins, who is living at the adjacent plantation, the Quarter Place. Oliver goes to live there. He's 8 years old. He tells us some stories about things that happened at Richland. But the most significant driver, if you will, to his want or desire to escape is when his cousin is sold. His cousin, William Dorsey, is enslaved on the plantation with him. And William Dorsey had a wife who was free, and he had children, small children. And I believe it was every other Sunday, Dr. Watkins would give William Dorsey a pass to go visit his wife and children. And on this one particular Sunday, William Dorsey's called to the kitchen door. This is how specific it is. We know what door he was called to. He was called to the kitchen door. He was given a pass. Now, he can't read. And he's also told that he needs to make a stop on the way, and he's given another note. The stop that he was told to make was to a slave trader. And the note said that he was to be sold. He couldn't read this, so he didn't know that that was the condition that he was in. He took the note to the slave trader and never returned. His wife showed up a few days later at Richland, made quite a scene, very upset, said, "Where is William?" They at Richland, the other enslaved people, said, "We thought he was with you. He went to see you." And she said, "He never came. And now I know what's come of him. Master has sold him." And she burst into the dining room and begged and pleaded for answers. And Dr. Watkins said, "He's gone, leave, and don't come back." And Oliver said he knew at that moment that he needed to go because agitation was rising amongst, he calls it other plantations. More and more enslaved people were successfully escaping, and enslavers were agitated and concerned. And so he decided that it was time to go. And now he does say after that, shortly after that, a slave trader arrived with enslaved people who were chained together, came in a wagon, and he came up to Dr. Watkins' home and said, "Would you like to sell Oliver?" And Dr. Watkins called Oliver in and said, "Would you like to go with him?" So there's this psychological game that's going on, right? I don't know that this was a real attempt to sell him. It could have been just to instill fear in him. But he said, "Would you like to go with him?" And Oliver said, I knew how I needed to respond. It wasn't what I wanted. I needed to speak on behalf of my enslavers. And I said, "I don't think my mistress can spare me." And Dr. Watkins said, "Well, there you have it. It's not time to sell Oliver." And the slave trader left. So it gives us a glimpse into just the psychological warfare that was happening.
Not long after, I think you said he left in a Methodist tent revival. Can you talk about how he got there and what led to that?
Sure. So they were planning, there were a multitude of them that were planning an escape, inclusive of Oliver's brother, his older brother, Reuben, who was enslaved by the same family. But again, the siblings, the descendants of Gassaway, had distributed the enslaved people. So Reuben was in Baltimore working at the Barnum's Hotel as a waiter. And so he wasn't on Richland or Walnut Grove, but he was part of this group that was planning to escape. So the first attempt to escape happened about a month before the actual escape. And in that first attempt, they had organized themselves. They had learned the call of the panther, which was really interesting to me to realize, because Oliver said there were panthers in the trees at the time. Who knew that there were panthers in the trees in the Baltimore area in 1848? So they taught themselves the sound of the panther because they were going to use these calls to communicate with one another. And something happened. The plan was foiled. They would call and they wouldn't hear anything come back. And they thought that the plan had been discovered. So they decided to abandon the plan. Well, Reuben had already embarked on this planned journey. And he said, "I can't turn back because if the plan is discovered and I go back home, I could be sold." So he continued and he successfully made his way here to Lancaster. So a month later, Oliver realizes Reuben is gone. They don't know if he's been captured, if he's successfully escaped, but the camp meeting, the Methodist camp meeting, is about to take place. And what we have learned is that the enslaved people seemed to attempt to escape during times when the enslavers were going to be busy with other things or distracted in some way. I've heard that Christmas was a big time to escape, despite how cold it might have been. But the Methodist camp meeting took place every August. And so he apparently was familiar with this and decided to use this as an opportunity. He knew that there would be several days where they would camp out, if you will. It didn't seem that he knew exactly what his role was going to be. As a matter of fact, there was a point where he was afraid he wasn't even going to be able to go. he, on the morning that the family, the enslaver's family, was preparing to go, he was asked to stay back with Miss Lizzie, he calls her, who's now a child. And so he wasn't sure if he could go, if he was going to be allowed to go. But Dr. Watkins told him that he could go, but he wasn't to ride in the carriage with the family. He was to escort Miss Lizzie, who was about 10 years old at the time. And so he waited back with her. And they waited quite a bit because the carriage would create dust as it went down the lane, and she didn't want to ride behind the dust. So they were going to wait to give the carriage an opportunity to make some distance. And this is where Miss Lizzie forgot her riding whip upstairs. And she said, Oliver, would you go to my bedroom and get the riding whip? And this was a unique opportunity for him to be in the house while no one else was there. And he did go to Dr. Watkins' bureau and take a revolver out of it. So he's really preparing now to go. He got in trouble because as they left Richland and they went out onto Shepherd Lane, Lizzie took off on her horse, right? She was quite the character, apparently. She took off at the speed of lightning on her horse, and he took off after her riding this very young colt, whom he names. And they caught up with the carriage. And Dr. Watkins leans out of the carriage and he sees, Lizzie and Oliver making a beeline, and he starts yelling and he's upset. You're going to injure the colt. And Lizzie came back. Apparently she shot past the carriage. She came back and said, don't blame Oliver. It was my fault. I was the one that was riding fast. And so they made their way to the camp meeting, but Dr. Watkins is now displeased with Oliver for the duration of the day. They spend the day doing, then he talks in the autobiography about what happens during the day at the camp meeting. So there's the preaching. He talks about the various preachers. He describes the preaching. There were some preachers that were more aligned with slavery than others. There were some that were slaveholders. And so there were different services. There were services where the white people would take their seats and listen to the preaching and sing hymns. And when they would take their recess, he called it, then the enslaved people would take over and sit in the seats. And he said the best amongst us were those that could sing the best. So if you were the loudest singer and the best singer, you were in the front. And you were revered. And then he talked about the Amen corner. He said old Uncle Dick, who was enslaved with him on his plantation, by the way, sat in the Amen corner with his eyes closed, and the preacher would say, okay, slaves, you must obey your master. The Bible says so. And old Uncle Dick would close his eyes and say, amen, amen. And he said old Uncle Dick would be the first one in the hen house stealing the chickens or the hams or whatever. So he talked a lot about that, what was going on. It gives us a sense as to what this camp meeting was like. He said there were thousands of attendees. I don't know if there were thousands or hundreds, but in his mind, as a 16-year-old now, there are thousands. And he asked if he could stay. Preacher Brown was especially known. He was an enslaver, and he was especially known for preaching that you must obey your master. And so he used that. He asked if he could stay late that night because he really wanted to hear Preacher Brown. And in his autobiography, he describes how he's thinking, that he knows what he needs to tell them for them to impart these favors on him. So he asks, and they say, oh, I don't know, Oliver, your master's not feeling too happy with you. You almost killed that young colt today. And so he said that, he started looking very serious, and they said, oh, Oliver, you're looking so serious. And he said, I tried to look even more serious when they said this. And so they felt that he might need to stay and hear the word of God. And so eventually he was allowed to stay. Now there were a number of them because now groups of enslaved people are together at this camp meeting, and they've had the opportunity to connect and talk about this plan, and there are 15 of them.
There was 15 people planning to escape that day? That's a big number.
15 of them have decided to go together. And so after they had their evening service, he went to the tent of his sisters. So the woman who was one of Gasaway's daughters married Albert Warfield. Their child who was an infant at this very point, became the governor of Maryland, Edwin Warfield. Edwin was just born at this moment that they're at this Methodist revival. Oliver's sister Betty was sent with the Gasaway's descendant who married Albert Warfield, and she is now the baby's nurse. So he even tells his sister, I suppose I'll see you on Sunday. He doesn't even tell his own sister that he's planning to go, right? And so he goes to the tent of Mrs. Warfield, and he gets his supper, and he's preparing to leave because he knows it might be a while before he has any more food. And as soon as night closes over them, it starts to rain, they escape.
All 15 of them together?
Yeah.
So they're like, do you know what the environment looked like? I remember there was a quote that they were sort of just like feeling their way through the darkness.
Yeah. First they were on the road. Mm-hmm. So a couple of weeks ago, we went to the exact location of the escape. 2 weeks ago, we went to the Hobbs, this fugitive ad that was placed by William Watkins says that Oliver escaped from Hobbs School. We just learned that Hobbs School still stands. It is now siding on the outside and drywall on the inside, and a 90-something-year-old African-American woman lives there. And we didn't know that was the actual school until we talked to the family. And so we were able to go there and see the jump-off point of the escape. We believe he took an actual road, because before he talks about being in the woods feeling his way, he talks about being on the road and hearing wagons. Mm. And every time they heard a wagon, they would drape down in the tall grass, which was very wet at this point because it's raining and it's a very dark night, thankfully. And then eventually, as people were leaving the camp meeting, there were more wagons on the road, so they went into the woods. And that's where you read that they were feeling their way. It was very dark. And, he talks about the wish of the wind through the trees and the roar of the river, and it kept making them think someone was on their trail, but there wasn't anyone. There was no talk of dogs or any of that. And they had directions. They weren't just feeling their way. They had been given directions by a miller whose name was Mr. Fisher. And Mr. Fisher was known to give directions to, Oliver said, to slaves on how to escape. So he said, we had our directions step by step on how to go.
How did they meet Mr. Miller? Or his name was Mr. Fisher.
Mr. Fisher.
He was a miller.
Yeah, I don't know. He said he was known.
What do you think the role of religion was in his life? He escaped from a Methodist tent revival, but then he went on to live with the Cartlands, and I believe they were Methodist. And what do you think he identified as, and do you think it inspired his journey at all?
I don't think I don't have any indication that religion played a major role in his life, but I believe the opportunity to meet, and I think this was common at the time, those one-room schoolhouses were also used as places of worship. And so you have school, education, you have religion, and then you also have community meetings all taking place together in one place. And so we know that the Methodists at the time there were meetings, right? So you would worship, but it was also these small groups of people who were meeting to, advance their community or advance their own interests or just meet to organize. Oliver did talk about that the enslaved people would meet at what he called the Old Friendship Meeting House, which through research we've learned was a Methodist meeting house, but they would meet outside in what the minister now today in Maryland told me was a hush harbor. So they would meet outside. This place was called Rattlesnake Springs, where they would meet near Clarksville, Maryland, where he was enslaved. And it was illegal for them to meet without having the oversight of someone who was white. So I think that did happen. I think they had that oversight, but they also used those opportunities to meet and organize. He did, when he got to Philadelphia, he did join an Episcopal church. So he joined the very historic St. Thomas Protestant Episcopal Church, which is an African-American church still in existence today. And that's where Oliver said all of his children learned to sing.
That's so cool. Do you know when he was at that Methodist church back when he was in Maryland and in Richland, was the I guess the minister there, was he involved at all with connecting the enslaved people where they could speak there? Were they making plans to possibly escape, or are they just having community meetings? Do you know?
When they were going to the Rattlesnake Springs, the
Yeah.
Old Friendship Meeting House, he doesn't say that they were making plans to escape while they were there. Yeah, he just said that they were, they would go there on Sundays and have the opportunity to connect.
Do you think it was a church service or just like the only way they could connect as a community?
I think it was a church service, but they also used it as an opportunity to connect and not just connect to organize for escape, but also to fall in love, right? And to date. And I mean, all of this stuff went on. So when we think about Cynthia, his mother, and the fact that she married a free man from another area of the county, well, how did they meet, right? They didn't meet on a plantation. They probably met in these community situations where they were brought together. William Dorsey and the fact that his wife was free. So when we think about slavery, what I find really fascinating, and it's the part that I prefer to think about, is the communities, these gathering places, and how there's one story that's very telling. Steve and I laugh at this a lot because there was one point where when Oliver's brother Remus escaped, they came to Richland looking for him in the middle of the night. And I think it was one of the elderly women, probably one of Gasaway's daughters, who was older at the time, opened the window and said, what are you doing? Why are you here so late at night? Is someone sick? Because it's Dr. Watkins' plantation. And they said, no, Remus is gone. And we think Cynthia knows where he is. And she said, Cynthia doesn't know anything about where he is. He's probably over in Sykesville in a drunken spree. Or no, it was Ellicottsville, which is Ellicott City now, in a drunken spree. So now we have hints that, okay, so they had some liberty to move about where they were out drinking and, it's different kind of slavery. I'm not saying that this is slavery as it existed in the Deep South, what Oliver calls Georgia. So everything in the Deep South is Georgia to him. Sold to Georgia, being sold to Georgia was the worst thing. That was the worst fate. But up in this Baltimore area in Maryland, it did seem that they were operating in what seemed to be a more urban-like environment where they were moving between towns, meeting each other, traveling a bit. Sundays were a light day. They had some time off, and they were allowed to go out and connect with each other.
Going back to his escape, what do you know about how he made it to the other side, to the north, and where did he stay when he got there?
So he, the instructions from Mr. Fisher were to, and when we looked at it on a map, it's a straight shot from where he was. He was to head toward Westminster, but he was not to go through Westminster because it was too dangerous, Westminster, Maryland. He was to stay south of it and go around it. And so we don't know if he went around to the east or to the west. When we retraced it a few weeks ago, we went to the west, but he could have gone to the east. And then as you go around it, due north of Westminster, you hit Hanover. So he went through Hanover. He called it Hanover Junction. He calls it the Four Corners, which we found the Four Corners there still exists. It's a large intersection. He talks about stopping at a tavern and getting some food. He went through York, Pennsylvania, and he said William Goodrich came out when he was going through York to speak to him and give him some more directions. And they went on through what he called Mount Pleasant, which is now Mountville. There was a tavern there where they went to the back door and a woman sold them food. That tavern is still there and there's still a back door. And I went in it 2 weeks ago. And you go inside, it looks, a little more modern from the outside, but when you get inside and you look at the ceiling, you see the logs and just the wood's really old. And it was thrilling for me to be able to walk in and, every head, if people are at the bar, it's like 11 in the morning, the bar is full. It's a big place. And they all whipped their heads around to look at me and I told them the story and they thought it was the coolest thing that they were sitting in this historic place that had, I'm sure if Oliver went to the back, he probably knew that this was a safe place to go and get some food. I got the sense that he was getting a lot of instruction on where to go and where not to go. And then after Mountville, or what was then Mount Pleasant, he came into Lancaster and he went to the office of Thaddeus Stevens.
I'm interested in the places where they say it's not safe. Like, what was it? Westminster. Do you know why they said don't go around Westminster?
Too many patrolmen. And that was the word he used. He said there were too many patrolmen in Westminster, so it wasn't a safe place to go through. Had to go around it. There's a story where, and I did leave this part out, where they crossed the bridge, the covered bridge from Columbia, or into Columbia from Wrightsville. And so when they got to Wrightsville, the bridge at the time had a toll gate. And so you had to ring it, and this is midnight, he said, around midnight. He said they had to ring the bell and wait for the toll keeper to come. And they were afraid that if he saw this many of them, he would know that they were escaping. And so they all hid behind a pile of logs, which makes sense now that we know that in today's hindsight, we know that the lumber mills were there. And they hid behind a pile of logs, and one of them, not he, but their leader, Ben, went to talk to the toll keeper that came down and said, we need to get across. They had planned what would happen if the toll keeper said, show me your papers, but he never did. He told them what he would charge them. Apparently they had some money. They all came out from behind the logs. They paid, and he lifted the gate and he let them in. Now, this is a covered bridge, and at the time, it's the longest covered bridge in the world. It's more than a mile long. And so the toll keeper then lets them in, and he closes the gate behind them. Now, in their minds, it's like, oh boy. If he really wasn't a friend, we are screwed. Because now we're locked into this covered bridge. We can't get out. All we can do is get to the other side and see what happens. And when we get to the other side, guess what they have to do? Ring the bell again and wait for someone to come and let them out. So they do that. He talks about how they rang the bell very gently. And the toll keeper came and let them out without issue. And they believed at this moment, this is really significant, they believed because they had crossed this large body of water that they were in Canada. They have reached freedom. It's over. Success. He says, we gave way to our feelings. He sang a song. He details the song. I don't know the music to the song, but it's written in the autobiography. It's about, Massey, don't come for me. I'm in the land of freedom where the colored people are free. And they fell asleep on the beach, believing they were free. And there's a beach right there. It's still there. And they're also, unbeknownst to them, they're on the grounds of Stephen Smith's lumber yard. They're on the beach and they're woken in the morning, and a man whom I believe was a white man says, "What are you doing?" And they said, we're in Canada. He said, "This is not Canada, and you're not safe. You've got to get out of here." So they were taken through Stephen Smith's lumber yard and then on from there to Mountville.
Where what state was Stephen Smith's lumber yard in?
They're in Pennsylvania at this
Pennsylvania.
point. Yeah.
Okay.
They're in Columbia, right on the banks of the river where Stephen Smith was operating.
It's like they were traveling in a group of 15 at this point still?
Yeah.
Do you know if all 15 of them made it to safety?
So I don't have any documentation that I know what he tells us, right? Which is that, and I've tried to really peel this autobiography apart. Before I had such the benefit, Gabrielle, that when I discovered this autobiography, I didn't discover it. When I was introduced to it, it was at the hands of a historian who was trying to get it. And so when I showed up, she thought, this is great. I've got the descendant. You can go to this Black antique dealer in Philadelphia and she'll probably give it to you. And of course, that didn't happen. But I had the benefit of Jody Fernald, who said, listen, as we started to get pages of the autobiography, she read it and she said, this is a lot. Like this, you're gonna have to prove every piece of this because no one's gonna believe that this actually happened. And so we set about for a year, we peeled apart every sentence. If he said he was here, we want to find proof that he was there. If he said he met this person, we wanted to find proof. I mean, he said he knew Frederick Douglass. Did he really know Frederick Douglass? Sure enough, he knew Frederick Douglass, right? And so, I don't have any indication that all 15 stayed together and made it together. I do have indication that when they got to Lancaster, he did say that they were at that Thaddeus Stevens sent them to Daniel Gibbons. Mm-hmm. And they stayed with Daniel Gibbons, and then the slave hunters came, and Gibbons went out in the middle of the night and got his wagon and put them all in the wagon. He said it was very crowded. And then they were taken and dispersed amongst the farmers in the townships, Salisbury and Bart and all those townships. And he talks about where he wound up. Now, he was by himself at that point, separated from the group. They had been dispersed. Mm-hmm. And this is where he reunites with his brother, with Reuben, remember, who had escaped the month prior. So he's at the home of James Jackson, Quaker abolitionist, and James Jackson's wife, whose name was Abigail, said to Oliver, hey, she starts just having a conversation. Where are you from? You're from that area of Baltimore? He says, yeah, I'm from the Baltimore area. And she said, oh, did you know a slave named Reuben who was a waiter at the Barnum's Hotel? And he said, yeah, it's my brother. And she said, well, he's right over there at the next farm. You should go see him.
So he didn't even know. It was just a coincidence.
He had no idea what had happened to his brother.
Oh my God.
No idea. And it was Abigail Jackson that put that together and said, you should go see him. And he went to see his brother, Reuben, who was ill at the time. He recovered. And Mrs. Jackson said to Reuben and Oliver, you've got to change your names. Well, apparently Reuben had been, he was at Asa Walton's farm at this point. Before he got to Asa Walton's farm, he had been with Ms. Gilbert. And so Reuben said, I'm going to change my last name after Amos Gilbert. And he actually changed his full name. Reuben changed his name to Amos Gilbert. And Oliver said, I'm just going to take the last name and I'll be Gilbert like you. And that's where we became Gilberts ever since. It was at the hands of Abigail Jackson, who's the wife of Quaker abolitionist James Jackson.
That makes me tear up. That's like the higher power moving through time to connect them and then moving this story into your hands. That's so incredible.
And 2 weeks ago, I was taken to James Jackson's farm by Abigail Jackson's brother's great-granddaughter, who had all the records from her family's abolition work.
Do you know, she had the records, like what did those records look like? Where were they keeping them all that time?
It's amazing. The Quakers and the Mennonites in this area, we're right here, have a tremendous amount of history. They're in binders and booklets, and there was one woman, Mennonite, descendant of the abolitionists that welcomed us to her home, Joanne Segrist. Don't know if you're familiar with her, but she welcomed us to her home 2 weeks ago and opened one of those hallway sliding closets where you would normally find coats. She had nothing but binders.
Oh my God. How far back do you think they went?
Oh, God. I mean, they went back to, I don't know how far back they went. I didn't look at all of them, but she had a table bigger than this table. She had invited a number of us, but it was for Oliver, for this 175th commemoration of his escape. Dining room table bigger than this, and at every place she had binders, and we would just pass them around and look at the history.
That's so incredible. I want to get back to that as well, but I want to get as much time talking about Oliver as possible while we're here. Once he found he escaped slavery. Talk to me about all his different careers. He listed several different careers. He was a music teacher, a musician, a politician, a speaker. How did he do all of those things?
So I'm not clear where he learned music. I don't know if he learned it, it would be speculation. I don't know if he learned it because he was a waiter in the house and there was music being performed, but clearly by the mid-1850s, early in his escape, he's performing musically. So he incorporated the lecturing and speaking about enslavement and his escape with musical performances. We do have some of the original programs from his performances. They were part of the scrapbook. Now, back to the Philadelphia antiques dealer, I'm going to tie the bow here for you. So not only did she have the autobiography, she had the scrapbook in pieces, in pages. And one of the items in the scrapbook was an original performance program that folds out, and it's got Oliver and the family and multiple songs that they performed. So they performed what they called plantation melodies, but they also performed the classics, right? Mm-hmm. Current day classics at the time. And so I have found more than 150 newspaper articles on Oliver and his performances. And in those, many of them do describe him playing the piano, also him playing the piano, the organ, and I think there was a banjo that he played in some of them. And they talk about his voice, that he had this incredible deep baritone voice, but he performed with the entire family. So he raised his children to perform with them. I guess Maria, his wife, performed. I haven't really found her called out, so she may have just been more of a supporter. But the children were absolutely performing. Even one article describes baby Gilbert performing. So small children. Again, I don't know where he picked up that talent and ability, but by 1865, he's now professing to be a music teacher as well, and he's calling himself Professor Gilbert.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
I don't know. I want to. Well, also he was a politician as well.
He was.
Yeah.
Yeah. So he just had the opportunity just this week, right? Monday being Labor Day, to focus on what he did around two areas. Which one I wouldn't necessarily call politics. It's loosely politically related, but it is the work that he did around colored labor unions. So in the state of New York, he attended the very first. So 2 years prior, a national. So let me get my dates right. I think it was 1868, and I'll go back and check. The National Colored Labor Union was formed, national. And then the states began to form their own. So he attended the very first convention for the state of New York's Colored Labor Convention. His name is listed on the convention call that's published in the newspaper. And it's very long, and it says, calling all colored laborers in the state of New York, not only do we want you to come to Saratoga for the convention, which is where Oliver's living at the time, but we also need you to go and collect all this information. And here are the professions. Now, keep in mind, people were enslaved, so they knew how to do things, right? They're machinists, and they're holding all these wheelwrights and all these professions, but now they're freed, and they're not being accepted as paid members of these professional communities. So they have to figure this out. They were accepted in slavery. You did a great job, but you were enslaved. That's why we accepted you. But now that you're free, you're a threat. You're a competition for wages. And so they were starting to organize themselves in these unions, because they said, and I'm going to paraphrase here, but they said, if you won't accept us into your professions alongside white men, then we will forge our own businesses, and we're going to get plenty of work as Black men because we know how to do it better. Right? And so they're organizing. So the call goes out to the state of New York. Oliver is listed on this published call. And then the convention is kicked off. And he is, on day one, elected as secretary. Now, you were enslaved, right? 1848. We're now about 20 years later, and you're literate enough to be secretary. By the way, who taught him to read? The wife of Timothy Gilbert, another abolitionist in Boston, who was the deacon of the Tremont Temple. And so that's where he learned to read. So now he's literate enough to be the secretary of the Colored Labor Conventions of the state of New York. And he, newspaper articles every day of this convention are published. And finally, an adoption is, it's written that there's been an adoption, that the New York State Colored Labor Convention exists, and they're going to meet again in Manhattan in a few months, and Oliver Gilbert is named to the executive committee. So there he is. Now he's got a prominent role. When they met in Manhattan, Oliver is elected chairman. And I don't remember exactly whether this was I think it was the Colored Labor Convention, but he's also now the chairman of the Colored Republicans for the state of New York. And there's an article that I've found where they're on Broadway in New York. He has the laborers erect a stage right in the middle of Broadway, and he leads a torchlit parade at night of men down Broadway from one hotel where they were holding the convention, down Broadway to the front of this other hotel, big hotel, and he ascends the stairs to the stage and gives a speech.
So they're protesting to get people to accept their work.
Yes, and they're organized. So they're organizing politically, colored Republicans, and they are organizing the labor unions.
And he had to have quite a bit of pull. I mean, he was elected on the first day. Yeah.
I get the sense from him that he just carried himself in a certain way, right? If you carry, your perception is reality. If I walk in this room, larger than life, I could be nobody, but you would think, wow, who is she? She must be something, right? So he carried himself in a certain way, and he created reality from perception. I think every room he went into, and think about it, I mean, first of all, he's already done the unthinkable. He's already escaped slavery at the age of 16. He's probably feeling pretty good about his chances for whatever else he might want to do. So I just get the impression that and also because there's probably a part of it where, because of the position that he had as an enslaved man, being the waiter, the personal waiter to a Revolutionary War hero, he was being infused with a lot, whether they meant to do that or not, which we know they didn't, but he was picking up a lot of how to carry himself, how to speak, how to address people, he leveraged those opportunities and then capitalized on that later. I'm
interested as well. Do you know when he met his wife and what role she played in his prominence as an organizer and a politician and a musician, all these different roles he had?
Yeah, so interesting question. Maria, now that you asked that, so he married Maria in 1865 in Saratoga. Exactly when they met, I'm not sure. She was 10 years his junior, so she was born in 1842. And so she's young when they get married. You could assume that they met shortly before that. She was not from Saratoga, by the way. She was from Rome, New York, Oneida, New York, and her father was an African-American. He was a black man, but it's questionable where he was really from because his story seems to change on every census. So I'm not really sure. We might presume that he had been enslaved. On one document, he lists his origins as Washington, D.C., something else, he's from Virginia, something else, he's from somewhere else. But we are clear that her mother, Anne Thompson, was British. She was a white woman from the UK. And Oliver spends a lot of time telling us that his wife was very well educated. And so it was she who actually wrote the autobiography. He may have dictated it to her. He probably didn't have to dictate much because she knew the story, right? If she attended lectures of his for 50 years, she knew the story, but it is in her handwriting. And so we know that because Oliver traded letters with Edwin Warfield, the governor, who filed those letters upon his death. Oliver has his own file folder at the University of Maryland in the governor's collection. And in there we have Oliver's letters, which are always typed. There's one handwritten letter, I believe, but Maria wrote hers in her own pen, and the handwriting matches that of the autobiography. What role did she play in, I don't know that I don't have any indication that she played a major role in his endeavors in politics. However, that doesn't mean that she didn't. I'm struck by how little Oliver gives detail around his wife and his mother and his grandmother. So I do think that was more of his condition at the time, that it's the men and their efforts that we're going to talk about, and the women will be identified. We'll know a little bit about them, but we're not going to spend too much time on that. I do wish we had a lot more on that.
It feels like her influence is she's written we don't know how much. I mean, I wonder how different the autobiography would be if he had written it in his own hand, and because in a way it's her writing as well.
Yeah,
it is her
exactly.
Writing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But I think one of the things that shocked me about his story is that he went back and he talked to his enslaver's son, and then he kept up written letters with him as well. Do you know why he did that? I mean,
Yeah. He says why. He says that he wanted to show them what freedom had done for him. Actually, the autobiography opens with that exact scene, with him going back. The opening lines of the autobiography are going back to Dixie. And I thought, wow, that sounds like the name of a book to me. I think it's the name of a song, actually. But so he opens it, going back to Dixie. It was 1884. The family had just had a very successful engagement. So he's got money at this point, because he opens it by saying, we just had a very successful engagement. I think it was 40 nights at Rand's Opera House or something, right? And so he's now singing and performing as part of under the auspices of the temperance movement. And he talks about preparing to go back. And he's living in Philadelphia at this point, but he goes to Manhattan to shop. He's shopping for his outfit to return. And he takes us from store to store. He went to this store to get the suit, and this other store to get the, and he says it like, and the Grand Hatter or somebody, we went there to get the hat, somewhere else for the silk umbrella. And so he's putting together this outfit because he very clearly needs to go back and show them what he's become. And he tells us the exact date that he leaves, what time he boarded the train in Philadelphia. He went to Baltimore. He spent the Sabbath, he calls it, with his family. He spent the night. The next day, he took the train to Ellicott City and hired a team of horses and a white coachman. And he says, I was very specific that I needed a white coachman. I hired a German to drive me out to the old homestead. And he goes to Walnut Grove. And it is actually his enslaver's brother, John, Gassaway's son, who opens the door. And he says, do you remember me? And they weren't sure who he was, of course. And he says, I'm Oliver. Oliver, was it you that left? And yeah. And they had been keeping track. So there was a census that was taken in Maryland, I believe it was right at 1867, right after the Civil War. They took a census. They went from, they invited slaveholders to account for their lost property such that they could seek reparations. So the reparations conversation didn't start with the descendants of enslaved people. It actually started with the enslavers who wanted reparations for their lost property as a result of the Civil War. And so Dr. Watkins took part in this reparations census, and he documented all of his enslaved people, but he also documented Oliver. And it says left in 1848, believed to still be alive.
wow.
20 years later.
That's
Yeah.
yeah. Do you know, I don't want to make you too tired. I have more questions about how you found all of this stuff and how incredible that story is, but I also want to give you a break if you want to.
Let's just take a minute. Yeah. I'll just get a little water.
So, how did you learn about Oliver the first time? You grew up hearing about, you had an enslaved ancestor, but how did you learn about his wider story?
So I remember this very clearly. I'd always been interested in genealogy. Mm-hmm. Ever since probably around the 2000 timeframe when I got, a computer. We were all getting computers around that, 1997 to 2000. And I got a computer at home and I loaded Ancestry.com onto it. And I don't know how long Ancestry was around, but, and I remember pulling up my grandparents in a census record, and I thought it was the most incredible thing. Now, I was not a lover of history. History was my least favorite topic. It's now my most favorite. But in school, it was my least favorite. But so I'm an adult woman, I'm a mother, and I'm at home, and I see this census record, and It's like, wow, I can see them, their neighbors, what street they lived on. History is starting to come alive for me. And so I, started building the family tree, and the genealogy was interesting. And I was at dinner with my cousins. And at the time, we were just doing dinner at each other's homes. I think it was once a month or something. We'd have these family dinners. And I was telling them about my research, and I said, I think I've hit the end of this particular line. I've hit slavery, and I know I'm not going to find anything. And I told them what I knew. And the next day, my cousin's husband had scoured the internet, and he sent me something on Facebook that's still there. And he said, "Is this the Oliver you were talking about?" And there was a newspaper article, or not a newspaper. It was it was a newspaper article written in New Hampshire about a lecture that had been given. And the journalist had attended the lecture and written about it. And it was called something like "As I Please Beneath the Underground Railroad" or something like that. And I said, "Oh, I don't know if this is him. Like, why would he be in the newspaper, right?" But I called the journalist, and the journalist said, "I don't know. I just attended the lecture. I'll connect you with the person who gave the lecture." And that wound up being Jody Fernald. And we compared notes, and she said, "I've been researching him for 10 years because she was connected to New Hampshire. She was at the University of New Hampshire. She was connected to the Cartland House, and she was working to get the Cartland House on the Network to Freedom certification, National Park Service." And so we talked, and she said, "Sure enough, we're talking about the same person. This is your family." And she said, "Do you know about your family papers in Philadelphia? That antiques dealer has them." And I said, "We don't have family papers. We're just like a basic family. Like, I think of family papers, you've got to be wealthy or somebody did something important." And she said, "You do. You have family papers. There's some sort of memoir." She had received, I believe, a page or 2 pages of it sent to her for her Network to Freedom application. But, Mrs. Hawkins would not give up the rest. And so she put me in touch with Mrs. Hawkins, and we began to dialogue. And Ethel Hawkins told me things about, Oliver Gilbert and his journey that I didn't know. And that was when I swiveled to my elderly cousin and told her about this. And I said, "She's got these pages from a scrapbook." And she said, "Yeah, there was a scrapbook." And that's when it started to unravel for all of us that, these things must have been in the home of William Gilbert, who had passed away, Oliver's grandson, and no one knew that they were there. And here they are.
How does finding out someone has been studying your ancestor for 10 years feel? I mean, it feels like the ground would just move out from under you.
Yeah, it was very surreal. I mean, 2 things. One thing was, to learn that you have this history in your family. It's a little frustrating that the family didn't know. And then I started to think, well, what else is out there? If we didn't know this. And then there was a part of me that thought, well, if she's been researching him for 10 years, why didn't she ever call me? Right? Like, didn't you tell the family? But, I realize everyone doesn't do things in the same way. But yeah, I had a lot of questions. And she had a lot of answers. I didn't know about the New Hampshire piece. I didn't know about, and she immediately started to collaborate with me and, introduced me to the Cartland descendants, at least the one descendant, Carl, who was Moses Cartland's, I think either his great-grandson or second great-grandson, whom I eventually did meet in person.
I'm really interested by this process of trying to claim ownership of your family's belongings. These autobiography, all these pictures and documents, they were your family's stuff, and they're in the hands of all these different collectors. What is that? Can you just talk about how that feels, trying to reclaim those things.
Yeah. So that was crazy frustrating. It was unexpected. You know, when I met Ethel Hawkins by phone, I thought, of course, she's going to give this to me. Like, I would. Look, I found your, here you go, right? And she said, no, it's going to go in the museum. And I said, do you have a museum? No, but we're going to have one. Okay. So, it was that item. It was Oliver's hymnal that he had traveled with that was in the hands of the Cartlands that they showed me but wouldn't give me. It had his name on it and everything. It's been very frustrating because enslaved people, if he was able to carry things, whether it be from Maryland all the way up to New Hampshire or Boston or whomever, if he treasured these things enough to be on this journey, this perilous journey, and carry these few things with him, how important those things must have been. And so to now know that they exist and for people to corroborate, like, yes, this is his, that's why we're not giving it to you, is very frustrating because we have nothing. We have nothing of tangible evidence other than what we've been able to start to piece together bit by bit now.
And then there's also this, like, Miss Ethel Hawkins, she didn't want to give her his stuff because she was very paranoid about the university manipulating her to take the autobiography. Like,
at first,
it was going to be on a loan, which means they're taking it forever. Like, can you talk about why you think she was so worried about that, anxious about that?
So in the beginning, before I met her, she had been engaged in conversations with the folks from the university, and it wasn't just Jody, it was others. And I think they, like I, were surprised that she wasn't willing to share more. She wasn't willing to share more because she had ideals about what she wanted to do, right? She was an Oliver. She had these dreams and these plans, and she was going to execute this, despite that she had no museum, but she did have a storefront. It wasn't an impression. She actually told me that she was insulted by the folks from the university because they had told her that if she didn't hand over the document, it would go into obscurity. And she was insulted because in her mind, she had plans for it, and it was not going to go into obscurity. And she wanted Black people to tell our own history in our own communities. And then she didn't think that she needed to relegate all of this to a university necessarily, that we would be able to do this ourselves. And so that was from her own mouth to me what she was concerned about. And then when I showed up, she was even more skeptical because she couldn't see me, she didn't know me, and she thought I was part of the plot, right? And so it took us some time. As a matter of fact, she wasn't truthful with me in the beginning about some things, and later on I called her on it, and she said, well, it was because I didn't know you, I didn't trust you. We had to get to know each other before I was willing to reveal everything to you.
And I know you left this on a cliffhanger on your blog, but can you say what happened to the rest of Ms. Hawkins' collection after she passed away?
I don't know. It wasn't a cliffhanger intentionally. Oh. I really don't know. Luckily I got a number of items from her. I think I got a significant number of Oliver's items, at least what she had. We don't even know what she never got of his, right? It was a trash bag. And what happened to the rest of not only Oliver-related material, but all the other pieces of her collection? She had a lot, enough that she had a storefront. She passed away. She, according to her sister, she developed cancer that was rapidly spread, wasn't, necessarily treated as soon as it should have been, but she also developed the onset of a dementia. And so they were more concerned with her health, not the collection. And they don't know what happened to the collection of artifacts. So
It feels very full circle. It started with someone cleaning, a house cleaner coming, and then was it a house cleaner that came to
yes,
the house in the end?
Yes, they had cleaned out her home. Yeah.
That's, I feel like that's a great transition into how do you teach, are you teaching the younger generation in your family, like how to preserve history, how to prevent things like a house cleaner coming and throwing the autobiography into a trash bag? Like, are you?
Yeah, I'm trying to do a better job of identifying what things are. And so just recently we had, a month ago, I had a little family dinner and had people over, not for this purpose, but while they were there, I went upstairs and got the autobiography and other assorted documents and artifacts, and everyone sat on the floor. We even had friends over. And people sat down, and although they've been hearing me talk about this for years, it was the first time that they'd actually held things and seen it. And it was interesting for people to say, can you go do you have, and they were sending me back upstairs to get more. And everyone was very interested. I had a cousin who said at the time that this was the first time he's been a little distant from our family and not connected in as much as the rest of us. And he said, this is the first time I've really felt such a sense of pride about my own legacy and lineage. So I'm just trying to ensure that my children and our cousins and everyone knows this is what we have. This is what it looks like. This is where I keep it. And I have not done this yet, but I've been meaning to select someone that if something should happen to me, if no one else is interested, just go give everything to this person. They know what it is. And whether it's, a friend of mine who's an archivist or some museum, that things are cared for.
This story is, I'm going to write something like that into my will at this point.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's something a lot of families should consider.
Should.
Yeah.
Right.
The Washington Post article talked about Richland, and it brought up such interesting conversations. I wanted to ask you about, like, when you go to Richland, what did it feel like for you connecting to your ancestors there?
Unfortunately, I never really had a lot of opportunity to feel like I was connecting. And that was the sad part about Richland for me. The first time I went to Richland, I was uninvited. I just drove up. They weren't home. They didn't live there full time. It was like a weekend. They didn't even go every weekend. I didn't know who they were, but I went. There was a gardener who was tending to the grass. And I hadn't planned on going, but was in the area and just did it. I was in flip-flops and I started to walk and I saw this shed. It was a smokehouse. And I knew that Rachel had died by the chimney corner, and I'd wondered if she'd died in the smokehouse. All the outbuildings still there, right? Everything's there. So I start walking through this grass and I get to the opening of this smokehouse, which is kind of falling apart. And I'm in my flip-flops and there's a snake. Right in front of me. And I have a picture that I snapped, and then I backed out and decided I didn't need to walk the grounds of Richland in my flip-flops at that moment. I needed to come back. But I did talk to the gardener who was there, groundskeeper, and I said, I just ran into a snake back there. And he said, oh, well, this whole plantation was called the Snake Alley or Snake. He said, he is a third generation to tend to Richland and to landscape Richland. And his grandfather, who started, said that there used to be snakes hanging from the trees when he was there. And he was under a tree. And he said, this tree right here would be dripping in snakes.
No, that's horrible.
Yeah. So I decided not to walk around too much anymore. But I did, that was the one time that I was at peace there and I was able to really connect. After that, I connected with the owners. and they invited us back down. But each time I went down after that, they were there, and it was more like we were guests of them. So I didn't feel as much connectivity. The last visit before, so you read about the Juneteenth picnic. That's how it was characterized, which makes it sound a little different than it was. It was going to be Juneteenth. And I contacted the owners and said, can I go to Richland? I wanted to go alone. I wanted to stand on the porch and pour a little something into the soil and say some prayers and stand barefoot, snakes or not. That was really what I was after. But they said, oh, sure, come on. We'll meet you there and we'll sit out. It was COVID. It was June of 2020. COVID was raging. But they said, we'll sit out on the porch and we'll make some food. And so I thought, well, take what you can get, right? So we went down. What I didn't know was that they had planned to divorce and they were going to tell us after that meeting, but didn't want to ruin that moment. So we all sat out there not knowing that they were going to divorce. And when I got home, I got an email. Yeah. But it's interesting because I have a video. I took my elderly cousin and her daughter, my other cousin, and Steve was there. And we took a video as we're pulling into Richland. We stopped at the gate because there's a long distance from the road to where the house is. And we went Facebook Live, I think. And we're happy. And we said, here we are, we're pulling in. We're going to show you all this plantation. And I said, I hope they don't break our hearts and tell us that they're going to sell it. That's exactly what happened. And they didn't tell us that day, but the result of their divorce is that they had to sell it. So, yeah, the end of Richland.
I think the article brings up the article, but also just the story of trying to get these pieces of your family's objects, their legacy, they're in the hands of all these different people, about reparations and what it means between descendants of enslavers and descendants of the enslaved. How do you think descendants should go about that conversation to be respectful and consider descendants of enslaved people?
Yeah. So the word reparations, to repair, right? To make repair, that can be done in any number of different ways. I don't have a solid opinion myself. I'm not ready to have an opinion on what should happen. So, I listen to a lot of different people and everybody's thing sounds good to me, but I'm also a realist. And so there's only but so much money. And a lot of that money, there's a lot of money, but it's not necessarily in the hands of everybody who was the descendant of a slaveholder. So this family is, fairly well off, but there are others that are more well off and there are some that are not well off at all. I do think America should approach it from a broader sense. I do think there should be some government conversations about this because it really was, slavery was in large part how America was built. And the benefits that we enjoy and the freedoms that we enjoy are often as a result of the work of enslaved people. And so I think of things like education, right? Free education or some sort of tax credits or something. I don't think of it right now as, oh, you should write me a check because, you benefited from slavery and I am a descendant of the enslaved. I'm not ready to formulate an opinion on that, but repairing does start with understanding, being open, conversations, being respectful, and just going about your day with these things in mind. And I think, my opinion on Melanie is that Melanie's not a bad person. She's not, I don't think she's a racist. I think she's quite the opposite. I think she's a very good soul, a good person. She just didn't think a lot about it. She didn't want to. She didn't even want to think about her own ancestors. I mean, you think about everything that she sent to auction. The stuff that I bought is really personal stuff from her own family. She wanted no parts of it. So I just think we have to be more mindful and careful in small ways as we go about our day. And we start by learning more about slavery, learning the beyond the generic whips and chains, people were in the field, they picked cotton. Yes, that happened. But go deeper, go a lot deeper and dig into, look at who in your family was enslaving and who were they enslaving. There's a great Facebook group now that started recently, and the group is white people who are the descendants of enslavers who want to help the descendants of enslaved. And they're saying, come on, bring your questions, bring what you need. We've got our records, we've got our family history. Let's connect, and we're going to share what we know, you share what you know, and we'll start to put these pieces back together.
That's amazing. Thank you for answering that. I want to have some wrap-up questions so we can leave on talking about Oliver. If you could, your family holds like a lot of incredible history, like off of the Richland site as well. Do you think, because we're here with the national parks today, can you think of any sites that you think should be set as sites on the network to freedom?
Associated with our family?
With your family, it doesn't have to be on Oliver's side, but there's so many, you have a lot of different relatives who are significant. Yeah,
it's hard for me to say because I don't know enough about the Network to Freedom and what the criteria is necessarily. When I think about the family and the my other collections and people that I'm interested in the family, it's the Scotts from Wilmington, North Carolina, and it's the Manleys. You may have seen that. Did you see that on the?
I didn't.
Okay, Alex Manley, and I don't know that this is how he would tie into Network to Freedom because I didn't go back far enough. They were free for so long. I didn't go far enough back to hit enslavement. But Alex Manley, in the late 1800s, African-American, Wilmington, North Carolina, owned and operated a printing press with his brother. And there was a woman, white woman, she may have been in Florida, somewhere in the South, and I think she became the first female senator in the U.S., but at the time she wasn't. She gave a speech, and essentially her speech was along the lines of, white men, you're not doing enough to protect young white women from these brutes, these black men that are just raping and pillaging our communities. You've got to protect them more. And so Alex Manley said, hold on. And he had a printing press. So he took his thoughts to press. And his article was, yep, there are a lot of white women that are with black men because they want to be. And I don't know where you're from, but we're not all brutes. As a matter of fact, we're enjoying relationships between white people and black people. And he published this in North Carolina in his newspaper. Now, Wilmington, North Carolina at the time was thriving, especially for African Americans. It was, they were operating businesses, in many cases more successful than the whites that were living there. And so the red shirts, which were the then version of the Ku Klux Klan, decided to come after Alex for that. And his article was reprinted. Back in the day, if you printed something in one paper, everyone picked it up. So that was reprinted, and they essentially came to town and burned Wilmington. The massacres happened. His printing press was destroyed. The black businesses were destroyed. He was run out of town and came to Philadelphia. And so the Alex Manley story is really significant. His son married my grandfather's sister. So that would have been Oliver's granddaughter that married Alex Manley's son. And his son became he was in Harrisburg doing something with the Urban League. So
The story just keeps getting more and more interesting.
yeah, it's from Oliver, I'll say this, from him and that liberty that he sought and achieved, there was so much that spun off of it. So many things in his direct lineage that happened that are so significant to Black America today. Jack and Jill of America, right? The national organization, Jack and Jill. Well, Mary Gilbert Manley, Oliver's granddaughter, is one of the 20 founders. There are now tens of thousands of members of Jack and Jill of America. They put millions of dollars a year out into the Black community to educate Black children. Their mission, they were founded in 1938 in Philadelphia. And their mission is to seek advantages for all children that we desire for our own. And so they create those opportunities. But that's just one example of Oliver's direct descendants in short order changing the face of Black America.
One last thing I wanted to ask was if you could talk or say anything to any ancestor, what do you think it would be? Is there a particular ancestor that you just wish you could talk to just once and say something?
Wow.
Yeah.
That's a good question. I haven't thought of that. I've thought, would I want to meet them? I would. And then I thought, well, what happens if they look totally different than they look in my head? I'd be so thrown off. You ever have that happen where you talk to somebody over the phone for months or years and then you meet them in person and you're like, whoa, okay, let me reframe. But I haven't thought about what I'd want to say. I mean, obviously, I would want to meet Oliver Gilbert just as much. I think I'd like to meet Rachel. I think I'd like to meet his grandmother, who had charge of Richland. So I want to know, if her mother, Celia, was the first African, which we don't know, but she's the first one that is listed. And in that letter that we have from the Warfields, she's the first one that they've documented. I would like to talk to Rachel because Rachel would be connected probably back to Africa. She was born in the 1700s. And then she would have also been connected to Oliver. So enough back, enough forward. I want more of the female perspective of what was happening. And I'd like to understand more about their roles. So I'd want to talk to them.
And then just to close things up, is there anything else that I didn't ask you about that you want to put on the record? Like something about Oliver that's just at the top of your mind, or anyone?
No, I don't think there's anything that I haven't shared here that necessarily, I get asked a lot about, where his grave is, and we don't know. We know where he was buried, the cemetery that he was buried in, Marion Cemetery in Philadelphia. We haven't found a grave for him, and they had a fire at some point way back, and the records all burned. So we know where he is, but not exactly where. I get asked that a lot. Other than that, no, I'm just thankful. I'm thankful for the opportunity to tell his story.
Oh.
I'm thankful that he left us with so much documentation, that he left us with not only the autobiography that he took the time to ensure. It was meant for publication. At the end of each page is a word count in circles, and I've counted the words and they match. So he meant it for publication. And I'm thankful for the fact that he left us with so much proof, not just breadcrumbs, but loaves of bread that he was leaving along the way, so that when we got to this point and we have this autobiography, that we can go back and corroborate every step and say, oh, look at that. You published that in the newspaper. Oh, look at that. You're on record with the Vigilance Committee paying for Isabella, right? You did send William Watkins down, a different William Watkins, to go try to rescue your sister. All of those proofs are so important. So I'm thankful for the opportunity to tell the story, and I encourage others to share their history. First of all, look for it. Don't just think because you're at slavery that you won't find anything. Believe it or not, this is really important. Believe it or not, and you all know this better than anyone, there's a lot of documentation for enslaved people, but we look in the wrong places. We look in census records where they don't exist, instead of chattel records amongst the beds and the cows and the oats and all of the other tangible items that are chattel. That's where the enslaved people can be found, but they are there. You just have to go seeking and actually listen to them, because I also get a lot of downloads. So thank you.
Thank you. We're so thankful to you and Oliver and Maria, and this is a wonderful interview. Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll close the interview.
Thank you.